I made a challenge for myself to explain plotting from the very simplest all the way up to something very, very complex. Level 1 is something that's so easy that even a writer who hasn't written anything can still benefit from it. And then level 7 is something that a best-selling author with many books under their belt can still benefit from and use. So let's get started with the very simplest form of a plotting structure, which is number 1, Booker's 7 types of stories. So the most basic fundamental way to think about your story is just in terms of the concept and how your concept fits alongside all the other story concepts out there. Enter Christopher Booker's 7 types of stories. He says that no matter what you're writing, it probably falls under one of these 7 archetypal storylines. First one is overcoming the monster. The protagonist must defeat a threatening antagonist to restore order and safety to their world, like in Alien. Number 2 would be rags to riches. A character rises from poverty or obscurity to wealth, success, or recognition. A good example of this would be Slumdog Millionaire. Third one would be The Quest. The hero goes on a journey and encounters obstacles along the way, but they get an important object or finally reach a crucial destination, like in Indiana Jones. Voyage and Return is a classic shape. Protagonist travels to a strange new world, experiences adventures there, and then returns home fundamentally changed. And a good example of this would be Lord of the Rings. A comedy would be just characters navigating misunderstandings and confusion or chaos before finally reaching some sort of resolution, and that's usually, marriage or reunion or something like that. And a good example of that would be When Harry Met Sally. And the 6th one would be a tragedy where a flawed protagonist's mistakes ends up leading to their downfall. Good example of that would be Breaking Bad. And then the 7th and final one would be a rebirth storyline where a character trapped in this dark or imprisoned state experiences some kind of transformation or renewal. And a good example of this would be A Christmas Carol with good old Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, the trouble with this super basic format is that you're really only getting the beginning of the story and the end of the story, right? You know how it begins, oh, here's where the character is, and then you know how it ends, happier or sadder, or, it's the conclusion of the arc. Now, of course, it is good to have the germ of the story and the concept of the story down, but I don't think it's nearly enough to give you enough guidance to actually be like, okay, now I know how to write my novel. What I think you need is a little bit more scaffolding. You need a little bit more framework than this. So let's move on to the next one, and as we continue to go through these, you're going to get more and more structure to them. So the second level of complexity when it comes to story frameworks would be Vonnegut's story shapes. Kurt Vonnegut sketched out the flow for 8 different types of stories, and you can tell that this is one level more advanced than Booker's because now we can see the story over time. We get the general drift of like how it's moving, say in the middle. He drew a vertical line where good fortune was at the top and ill fortune was at the bottom, and then he drew a horizontal line. And that was the story timeline with B on the left-hand side indicating beginning and then E on the end indicating the end. So let's look at a few of these to see how these help with your story. First one would be Man in a Hole. Things start out good for this protagonist, then something terrible happens, they dip way down, and then through hard work and ingenuity and struggle, they manage to come back up out of the hole and it ends on a happy note. Super simple, right? But then so many stories that you can think of, including maybe your own novel, fit this basic shape. Or look at this romantic-based one that he calls Boy Gets Girl. It starts sort of baseline, not particularly happy, not particularly sad. Something good happens, probably meets the potential partner, then loses the potential partner in some way, but in the end, gets him or her back and it turns back to happiness. A third story shape he talks about is rags to riches, and this is really the Cinderella storyline. You start as miserable and as low as you could possibly imagine, and then step by step by step, things get much better, then there's a huge calamity, but in the end, it still ends happy. Now, if none of those shapes seem to fit your storyline, take a look at this next one. Vonnegut called it the Old Testament shape. Basically, it's a little wavelength going up and down, tragedy, success, tragedy, success, tragedy, success, and then, oh, it ends in a terrible tragedy. It ends on a down note. And an example of this would probably be Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men, who in many ways very much is a kind of Old Testament-y writer. Okay, so those 2 early basic plotting structures, they give you a general drift for how to write your story, but they're usually not enough, right? So let's start getting into more complex, more framework-based structures and look at number 3, the three-act structure. This is one of the most basic and foundational story structures ever invented. Sid Field came up with this. He was a screenwriter, and so he made it for screenplays, but it's really applicable to any story you're trying to tell. Now, since he did make this for screenplays, it probably corresponds better to a short story than it does to like a full-length novel, just because it's not super complex. Look, with this three-act structure, we got the beginning, we got all that stuff in the middle with escalating conflict, and then we got the end. But really, the limitation of the three-act structure is, what exactly do you do in that middle? There's a lot of space there and not a lot of guidance. Oh, okay, escalating conflict. Gotcha. I'll just write that right up. That's very helpful. Now, I have seen some examples of the three-act structure where they try to like gussy it up and dress it up all pretty, and so you get a lot more stuff in the middle with a series of obstacles and then a big disaster and then, you know, leading to this crisis, which is the climax. And okay, like that's a good attempt to flesh it out a little bit more. Ultimately, though, the middle is the hardest place to write. The three-act structure doesn't give enough guidance on that. And that's why the next one we're going to look at does work a lot more on that middle section. But before we get to that point, I just want to say that if you're enjoying this video, wonderful. Please hit the subscribe button. That would help me out a ton. And if you're already subscribed, wonderful. I love you. Please hit the like button. That'd be brilliant. Thank you. All right, now it is time for stage number 4, which is the 5-act structure. Okay, now we're actually getting somewhere. Yeah, you could use this to write a book for sure. So a 5-act structure isn't super different from a 3-act structure, but it's just that the middle section is split into 3, giving you a little bit more guidance. So the middle is separated into rising action, climax, and falling action, which is helpful in terms of granularity because now we have 3 distinct steps like, oh, this is what I should do in this section of the book. Now, you might know the 5-act structure under a slightly different name and under a slightly different graphic. You might know it as the Freytag's pyramid. I do think the visual of Freytag's pyramid, it works much better if you are writing a tragedy. That's because right in the middle, we call it a climax, but you can think about it better as a point of no return. Everything's leading up to that point, and then something bad usually happens, and the rest of the story falls from there. So in Romeo and Juliet, this is when Tybalt kills Mercutio. But one similarity between Freytag's pyramid and the 5-act structure is that for both, there is one huge event happening in the middle. In Titanic, this is when the ship hits the iceberg. In Alien, this is when the creature bursts forth from the stomach. It's basically the tentpole concept of the story, where everything in the second half happens because of that central middle event. And if you want to get more in depth on all this stuff, in BookFox Lab, we go through stuff like the hero's journey, the heroine's promise, the Bookfox story scaffold, and Harmon's story embryo. So if you do find yourself that you need a little bit extra help, please click the link in the description below. Check out BookFox Lab. We'd love to work with you one-on-one. Okay, now it is time for the 5th level of story frameworks, getting a little bit more complex here with Dan Wells' 7-point story structure. What I think is really interesting about this structure is how it defines the midpoint. So everything leading up to the midpoint, the first half of the novel, is just the character in reaction mode. Things are happening to them and they're reacting. While everything that happens after that midpoint is the character being proactive, driving the narrative. Essentially, they go on storytelling offense. Let's also highlight the difference between plot point 1 and plot point 2. Plot point 1 is what gets the ball rolling. It introduces the protagonist. It starts to raise the stakes. Plot point 2 is when your character finally gets the knowledge or the experience or the wisdom that they need to solve the problem of the climax. Like in Star Wars, plot point 2 would be Luke hearing Obi-Wan say, "Use the Force, Luke." And that's when he switches off the targeting machinery and just relies upon the Force itself. And then here's a distinction between the 2 pinch points. Pinch point 1 is when the story is applying pressure to the character's old identity, while pinch point 2 is when the story starts applying pressure to the character's new identity. In The Great Gatsby, pinch point 1 would be when Tom questions Gatsby's past, the obscurity and poverty Gatsby thought he had covered up. While in pinch point 2, it's when Daisy doesn't choose the reinvented Gatsby, she still chooses Tom Buchanan. His reinvention of himself has failed. Now here's what most writers do wrong when they encounter this structure. They think, oh, 7-point plot structure, I'll just start at the beginning and then work my way to the end. Well, no, that's not the right way to do it. Dan Wells really points this out as he says you should start with the ending, start with the resolution, and then work your way backwards. So for an example of this, let's look at Interstellar. After crossing all these galaxies and covering so many decades, he is reaching back in space-time to try to connect with his daughter Murph. So if you start with that ending point and then you think, okay, so what does that tell you about the beginning? Oh, it needs to be some sort of reverse mirror. That means what the hook needs to be should be Cooper very much physically present with Murph, but not really connecting with her emotionally and struggling to get out into space. He has a yearning to like go out there. Okay, there are only 2 story frameworks left, and these are some of the best ones. Let's get to number 6, Save the Cat. Save the Cat is a 15-point beat sheet that guides you through every single stage of your story. And on the surface, this looks to be roughly, what, double the complexity of the 7-point plot structure? But it's actually a lot more flexible than that, because a lot of these 15 points can be repeated multiple times. So look at something like the fun and games beat, which is described as delivering on the promise of the premise, but I like to describe it as just showing your reader a good time. So in Jurassic Park, there's, at least 3 examples of fun and games. The moment when Grant holds that tiny little dinosaur, because that's total wish fulfillment and super magical. The moment where they explore the sick Triceratops poop, because that's humor. And then when Grant and the kids are in the tree and they're awakened by the Brachiosaurus who's eating the leaves, it's just a moment of wonder. And then when the dinosaur sneezes on them and they're covered in snot, oh, well, that's more humor. So these 15 beats could account for, say, 30 or 35 plot beats or scenes in your novel. And that's why it gives you way more flexibility than a lot of the other models we've been talking about. Now, there's also a beat called Bad Guys Close In, which is, yeah, pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's like your heroes are getting pressured and the antagonists are, right at their heels. So going back to Jurassic Park, there's actually 4 scenes that use this plot beat. The T-Rex attacks the kids in the car because of the flashlight. Nedry's car slides off the road and he's attacked by that, venomous dinosaur. Timmy's stuck inside the vehicle inside the tree and needs to be rescued them, which I should add, that's really nice that they break up all the dinosaur antagonist scenes and instead have just a very physical, dangerous scene where, honestly, the car is now chasing them. It's not a dinosaur, the car is chasing them. And then lastly, the classic scene of the T-Rex chasing the Jeep. The other advantage of Save the Cat is you don't have to think about all these steps in this exact chronological order, such as the B story, right? There's a specific place in Save the Cat where you're supposed to introduce the B story, but if you think about most B stories, it happens periodically over the course of the entire storyline. So going back to Jurassic Park, the B story would be Grant's relationship to children, how he doesn't want children, how he feels uncomfortable around children, and how gradually he learns how to become a better father figure and maybe soften toward children over the course of the whole story. The last thing in Save the Cat we're going to talk about is the midpoint. And we've talked a lot about midpoints in this video, and I love how every single framework has its own vision or take on what you should do with the midpoint. In Save the Cat, the midpoint is either a false victory or a false defeat. So a false victory would be like in Breaking Bad, where Walt's standing on that huge pile of money. It looks, for all intents and purposes, like he's truly won, like he's created this, billion-dollar industry essentially. But as you know the story, well, it's not a true victory. Things get worse from there. Or the midpoint could be a false defeat, like in Andy Weir's The Martian, when the airlock blows out and Mark Watney loses all of his potatoes, basically all the food that he could possibly eat. So on the surface, that looks like, oh, this is a huge defeat. He is definitely going to die on Mars. But then through that defeat, he ends up, working super hard and being super ingenious and coming up with a completely different strategy for saving himself. Okay, now it is time for number 7, the final one that we're going to tackle, the most complex one out of all these plotting frameworks. And you might be asking yourself, what's he going to talk about right now? What's more complex than Save the Cat? And maybe you're thinking I'm going to do the hero's journey because that's, 17 points, getting a little bit more complex, but I think I'm going to surprise you. The ultimate or most complex form of this plotting frameworks isn't a formula like all the others. It's kind of a step beyond the formulas. It's taking all the pieces of these formulas and freeing it from the corsets of these frameworks. Okay, is your interest piqued? I hope so. Let's introduce number 7, the toolbox. I think this is the way that many established writers of much more complex fiction, actually think about plotting, especially for fiction that doesn't fit neatly inside, a genre or fiction that isn't on the shorter side. What these authors have is more like a giant toolbox of a whole different bunch of storytelling techniques. I'm including this toolbox method because even though it gives a lot less step-by-step direction than a lot of the other frameworks that we talked about, it also gives you way more flexibility to tell tell more complex stories. Now, as you look at this toolbox, this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. You could easily add another 5 or 10 more. I'm just showing you an example of like, these are the types of things that would fit inside your storytelling toolbox. So honestly, you could choose any one of these to start your story with. Yes, you could start it with a confrontation, or you could start it with a big decision, or you could start it with a type of misdirection. But let me offer like a little warning here in case like some of you are like, this sounds like the one for me. Okay, well, to do this well, one, you really have to know a ton of stories out there and how I've internalized all those stories so they're very much built in, so you have really good instincts. And then two, you really have to already know all of these narrative storytelling devices really well, so you have a good sense for where they would fit inside of a story. If you're confident that you can rely upon your storytelling instincts and you don't need the more like step-by-step framework or some of those other models, then maybe this is the right one for you. But there are certain elements that you cannot avoid, and I think you should bring in from those framework structures. For me, those core elements would be something like an inciting incident, would be a midpoint or tentpole, mini climax, and then finally the big climax at the end. So what that does is it creates a very, very open-ended framework, and now what you do is you take your toolbox and you fill in all the middle pieces. So this could be a sample of what your story looks like when you fill in all those middle pieces. Obviously, like Save the Cat, you can use any one of these elements more than once, sometimes 2 or 3 times. Stuff like escalation, obstacles, and decisions, yeah, these will probably appear more than just, once in a novel. Now, if you're writing your first novel, this one probably isn't the best one for you. I'd recommend one of the simpler frameworks to start with. But hey, if you've got a book or 2 under your belt, if you've been telling stories for a long time, then yeah, go ahead and use a more complex framework like this. Hey, don't forget to check out BOOKFOX LAB in the link below if you need some coaching and assistance on your novel writing. And I hope this video has been helpful in helping you figure out what the plotting structure is that might be best for you as you tell your story. Happy writing.